Hello and welcome! I finally got the camera, so it doesn't feel weird to say hi anymore. And today we are going to make whatever you can see behind my back, which is this running man animation. It's actually a few fairly simple techniques layered on top of each other, plus a little bit of compositing. But don't worry, we will cover every step from start to finish, so you should be able to get somewhat similar result by yourself. And as always, if you manage to use it for one of your projects or some animation you're working on, I would really love to see that. So make sure to tag me on Twitter, link in the description. And without further ado, let's get into Blender. So first of all, we will need some animation. If you have your custom animation and your own model, then that's amazing. But for those of you who don't have that, I will use a Mixamo, which is a really great tool for those of you that never heard of it. You basically can download any animation that you can find here, along with some models, all for free. So I will use this default Y robot, and I will look for the running animation. This one looks fine, and then one thing to keep in mind, check in place, so the model doesn't run across your scene. Then you can change up some of those settings here that will affect the animation itself, and when you're satisfied with the result, you can just simply click download and then download again. After you save it on your PC, we can go into Blender, delete everything, and then go to File, Import FBX, then navigate wherever you downloaded your animation, and simply click Import FBX. If everything went well, you should have the model along with the animation downloaded, and when you click play, it should all be running smoothly, but just one loop of the animation. So that's something we need to fix right away. Click on one of the bones or select the armature in here, and then when you see the keyframes of your animation, with all of them selected, click Shift E and choose Make Cyclic, which is gonna take those keyframes and just loop them, so that now when we click play, we have this perfect loop of the animation that we downloaded. So with that out of the way, we can hide the armature because we don't really need these bones. And also right away, we can go into the model and material settings and just delete material from both the body as well as the joints. So minus again. So we have pure model with no material on it. And now the first step is to set up a camera. So Shift A, add a camera, and then Control Alt 0 to snap the camera to our current viewport position. And we can also go into View, Camera to View, and now we can position it however we want. So for the tutorial, I will go for the similar result that you could see in the intro scene, which is the character somewhat on the right side of the frame. It doesn't have to be perfect yet. You can always adjust it later, just the rough estimation of what you're going for, because that's just gonna simplify the further steps of placing stuff around the scene. So now that we have it roughly placed, we can drag in a new viewport, and in this viewport, we want to create a mesh UV sphere. Let's rotate it on the Y-axis by 90 degrees. So that we have a nice geometry going across, and the polars of the sphere are on each side of the mesh. And now this is gonna be our ground. So we want to position it a little bit lower and also stretch it on the x-axis. And while you're moving and manipulating this ground in this viewport, you can also see the preview of how it will look like in the final picture. So just make sure to put it somewhere here, make sure that it's big enough on both X and Y axis. And also we can go into modifiers and add a subdivision surface, maybe twice, and then right click, shade smooth. So we have a nice smooth surface of the ground. Now we can preview the animation, and you can see that our character is sort of sliding on the ground. And in order to sort of fake the movement of our character, we can go into the side view and take our sphere, our ground sphere, and just move it slightly to the left and also rotate it, so that in the end the bottom of the feet of our character is gonna be hidden behind the horizon, and that is just gonna help fake the effect of our character moving fast. Now we can already go over and create some materials for our ground. So select the sphere, change the viewport type to shader editor, and click new to create new material. This is gonna be ground, and we can also delete the principled BSDF and create a diffuse BSDF. Now usually when I create stylized stuff, I use the emissive shader node, but today I want this to react to the light on our scene. That's why we're using the diffuse BSDF. And so let's add a light source to our scene, Shift A, light, and I will go with area light, move it a little bit higher. And to see what we're doing, we can switch to the rendered preview. And as you can see, the ground is not receiving any light because the diffuse BSDF is not connected. So just make sure that you connect it to the material output surface. And now we can take this light and just move it a little bit off center, maybe make it bigger. so that the fall off is gonna be softer. We can increase the strength to maybe like 50, or depends what you're going for. I'll go with 30 probably. And we can also rotate it a little bit so that it's sort of facing our character, kind of like a sun. Now we can click 0 on the numpad, which is gonna take us to our camera view, and then click the ground. Now in order to make our ground more interesting and play along with the style that we're going for, I took the inspiration from the Captain Tsubasa animation, where you can see that the ground is basically just vertical lines of different shade that is moving past the character quite fast. So this is something we will do as well, and for that we will need a wave texture as well as the texture coordinates and a mapping node. Now let's connect it like so. The texture coordinates go into the mapping node from object to vector, and then the mapping output goes into the wave texture input vector, and the wave texture color goes into the diffuse BSDF color. And this way, as you can see, we have this wave pattern already going on across our ground, and then all we have to do now is just make some small adjustments to make it look a little bit more interesting. So first of all, I will add a color ramp right after the wave texture and change the interpolation from linear to constant so that we stay with this cell shaded aesthetic. Now in the wave texture I will change the scale to something like maybe 1 so that our stripes are quite thick, and also I will increase the distortion, the detail, as well as the detail scale. Now this is maybe a little bit too noisy, so let's bring down the distortion a bit. We only want a little bit jagged edges going across, nothing too crazy, and maybe a little bit of the detail roughness. And then how we will animate this, we will simply change the phase offset of the wave texture to move across. And for that we will simply type in #frame, which is gonna create a driver that is gonna move the value according to the frame of the animation that we're currently on. And so on the frame 1, the phase offset is 1. On the frame 29, phase offset is 29. It's pretty simple. When you click play, you can see that it's moving across. Now if you want to make it faster, you simply multiply this by, let's say, 2. That's a little bit too fast for me. So maybe 1.2. Feel free to adjust it to however your animation is looking, but I will leave it at this. And then we can put in some colors. So in the color ramp, instead of black and white, we will go with some greenish colors representing the grass. So the darker green and then the brighter one, sort of like watermelon. Now we can change again to the 3D viewport and adjust our ground because it's a little bit still too small. So we can just make it much bigger, bring it down, rotate it a little bit so that it doesn't cover too much. And then as you see, when we scaled the ground, then the pattern scaled as well. So we can simply go into our shader editor again and adjust the wave texture scale as well, so that it's still matching whatever we're going for. And yeah, I think that looks much better than the previous one. Now the next step is gonna be those white swooshes that are running around our character. That is giving it a sense of speed that you have in literally every anime that I can think of. I think it's called action lines even. So for that we will need another mesh. So let's add a cylinder this time and rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. And you can think of it as some sort of a tube that we want our character to be in, and then stretch it on the y-axis to make sure that in here, in your final render, you don't see either ending of the cylinder. Just make sure that you have it long enough. And we can also shade smooth this as well. And now with our tube selected, we can also name it. So this is our action lines, and then the previous sphere is our ground. Now with our aerodynamic tunnel sort of mesh selected, let's change into the shader editor and again click new to create new material. This is our action lines, and here we can also delete the principled BSDF and add a emission shader as well as transparent BSDF and also a mix shader node. Then let's connect it like so. The emission goes on the bottom and the transparent goes on top, and the mix shader result goes into the material output surface. And now the factor in mix shader is gonna be the mask that's gonna decide which areas of the tube is gonna be transparent and which is gonna be visible. So for that, first of all, let's add a noise texture node, and we will also need texture coordinates and mapping as well, but we can simply click on the noise texture and click Ctrl T in order to get it. This shortcut comes from the add-on that comes with Blender. You just have to enable it. Simply go to the Blender preferences, add-ons, search for Node Wrangler, and make sure that it's enabled. It's gonna save you so much time. So I just don't see reason why not to use it. Then the texture coordinates, let's change again from generated to object. And now to preview the noise texture, we can click Ctrl+Shift left mouse button on the noise texture. Again, it's a shortcut from Node Wrangler, just so you know. And we can see how the noise texture looks like. And because we're going for the cell shaded style, we don't really need all these gray areas, all this gradient. So let's get a color ramp, plug it in here right after the noise texture, and change the interpolation to constant again, which is gonna give us this sharp contrasty look. Now what's here to adjust is of course the details about our noise texture. So we can bring the detail all the way up and add the roughness a little bit. And in order to stretch it, we'll use a little bit of math nodes, but don't worry, it's nothing too crazy. So first of all, we will need a value node, then a math node, and a combine XYZ node. Now those three is gonna let us scale our noise on any given axis that we want. So connect the value node into our math node, change the math node from add to divide, and then the result goes into the Z axis, and the X and Y is coming from the original value. And now the result of the combine XYZ, which is a vector, just 3 values, goes into the scale. Now everything disappeared because our value is 0, so we need something here, at least 1. And then as we increase the divide value, you can see that our noise is being stretched, because while the original value, 1, is being passed to X and Y, the Z value is being divided by our divider. So that's just a much easier way to control the stretching, because otherwise you would have to manipulate the scale by hand. And that just can get really, really difficult when you're operating on small numbers. So I just feel like this solution is much more elegant. So let's just make sure that our noise is properly stretched, and we can also increase the scale overall to have a little bit more lines going on across. And while you're more or less happy with it, let's actually make sure that we see our character and everything, because for now it's just black and white image. So here at the end, after the noise texture, the color ramp goes directly into the mix shader factor, and then the mix shader result goes into the material output. And if after that you still don't see any transparency, that is because we need to go into the material properties and under blend mode, change the opaque into alpha clip. And that is gonna let us see through all the black values that we had from our noise. And as you can see, I see a little bit of that end cap of the cylinder, so I have to scale it a little bit more on the y-axis, just to make sure that none of this is visible in my final frame. Now one more thing, because as you can see we have light on our scene, and as we move it, it doesn't affect our character anymore. That is because currently our cylinder is blocking the light, so under shadow mode, just change it from opaque to none. Now in order to adjust how much of those lines are visible, we can go into the color ramp and just play with this value to make sure that we still see what's going on with our character. And then the last step is to animate those action lines so they are swooshing past our character as it's moving, because for now they're just staying in one place. So for that we need to go into the mapping node, and under location Z, you can see as we are changing the value, our lines are moving across the scene. So let's also put a driver in here, hashtag frame, and let's see how it looks like. Well, with hashtag frame it looks way too fast in my opinion. So in order to slow it down, we can simply put a divide by, let's say 20, and that's slowing it down quite a bit. But also, as you can see, it's moving in the wrong direction right now. So in order to reverse it, in front of the frame, simply put minus, and that should fix it. Maybe it's a little bit too slow right now, so just divide it by, let's say 10. If it's too slow or too fast for you, just adjust the value until you're satisfied. Now for the dust kick-up, that is really selling the fast-paced movement of the character. For that, let's switch the viewport again to the 3D viewport, and for now we can click on our action lines and just hide it from view so that it's easier to navigate around our character. And the dust kick-up is gonna be another UV sphere. And this time, similarly as previously, we want to rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees so that we have these polar coordinates in front and behind our character. Now first, let's position it behind the character, and also let's stretch it out a little bit. We can go into the edit mode and just take some of the vertices on the back. And while using the proportional editing, we can just make it bigger so that it looks a little bit more like cone. And we can also delete some of the back faces because they're not going to be visible anyway. And just really go for the cone aesthetic. That seems alright, I think. Just make sure that the beginning is at the base of our character's heels, but that also it's not clipping it through it. And now let's select our mesh, go into the Modifiers tab, and let's add a subdivision surface, first of all, just so we have more geometry to work with. We can also increase the levels to 2. And the second one is gonna be normal edit modifier, and the third one is a displace modifier. Now under displace, let's click new to create the new texture, which is gonna be displacing our object, and then on the textures tab, change the type to Voronoi. Here, one thing that we have to do is go under colors, enable color ramp, and just switch those values. So the white is on the left, the black is on the right, which is gonna give us this really nice bubbly texture. And don't worry about the size or the intensity right now, because later we're gonna control it with another object. So don't worry if it doesn't look great right now, it's gonna be alright at the end. So back to the modifiers, and here, as you noticed, we add the normal edit modifier, and this is gonna be the same technique that we used in my previous video with the Animate fire as well as the Dragon Ball aura. We're gonna add a empty, which is gonna be the normal controller, and now we're gonna go into our dust kickup, make it shade smooth, go into the object data properties, and under normals enable auto smooth, because this modifier only works when the auto smooth is enabled. And then under mix, change the mix mode to add, and then the target is gonna be the normal controller that we just created. And it may look like not much happened right now. That is because we also need to modify the displace modifier a little bit, change the coordinates from local to object, and let's create another empty. Plane axis is fine, and this time it's gonna be our displacement controller. We can move it a little bit higher so that we don't confuse it with the normal controller. And now with the dust kickup selected, under the displace, let's choose the object displacement controller, the one that we just created. And also the direction, change from normal to custom normal, so that whatever we are changing in the normal edit actually is being applied in our mesh. So now, as you take the normal controller and you move it around, you can see what really are we doing with it. We are basically changing the direction of the normals so that we are making sure that the dust kickup is coming from here, from the center, from under the feet of our character, all the way back. And you can see there is some little artifact going on with the dust kickup, but we can easily fix it simply by dragging our normal controller a little bit lower, something like this. And now everything should be fine. Well, it still doesn't look like dust, and that is because we need to now modify our texture that is controlling the displacement, and that is why we have the displacement controller. So as we scale it up and down, you can see that the displacement is being affected. So choose something that you're happy with, something that resembles dust cloud, more or less. And when you're happy with it, we're gonna animate it using keyframes. So with the displacement controller on the first keyframe in this location, click I to add a keyframe location. And then let's switch to, let's say, frame 20, move the controller a little bit backwards, and again click I location, which is gonna create another keyframe. And then while hovering over the timeline, click T and choose linear, which is gonna change the interpolation between those keyframes. And as you play it, you can see that this dust kickup is moving, but we want it to keep moving similarly to our character. So you simply hold Shift E, and this time instead of make cyclic, we're gonna choose linear extrapolation, which is gonna make it move infinitely based on just those two keyframes. So as we click play, you can see that it's moving. And if you want it to move faster, you can simply take the second keyframe and just move it closer. And similarly, to make it move slower, you just make them further apart. I think I will leave it somewhere here. You can always adjust it later, but I will leave it at this. And now, as you can see, we have this shadow going on our dust kickup. And in order to remove it, we will do the same trick as we did with our action lines. So we will choose our character. We will go into the shader editor, create new material, which is gonna be character, and this is gonna be very simple, and this is gonna be just very simple shader. We can leave the principled BSDF and only add a shader to RGB and connect it right after, and then add a color ramp right after shader to RGB, change the interpolation again to constant, and now we will only use this color ramp in order to lay on some colors on our character. So we had him red in the intro scene, so I'll do something very similar in here. Just choose 3 color stops, red, a little bit lighter red, and then pretty bright red, something like this. And as you can see, as I move those color stops across, we have this nice cel shaded look to our character. And because we are converting the principled BSDF into RGB, this shading is not just stuck on our mesh, but it reacts nicely with the light. So as we move the light across, the look of our character changes. So it's very interactive. And now we can also select the joints, go into the material tab and choose the same character material that we use for the body. And under the shadow mode, again, change opaque into none so that it doesn't cast any shadow on our dust cloud. Now, speaking of dust cloud, let's just select it, click 0 on the numpad to get back into our render preview, and in the shader editor, click new to create new material. Here again, literally the same technique. We just take principled BSDF, shader to RGB, and then a color ramp, change linear to constant, and again we're gonna start laying in some colors for our cloud. So this one we're going for more browny look, something like this, a little bit lighter, and the super bright. But this time we don't want our dust cloud to be brightest in here, but we want to reverse it. So simply reverse the color steps on your color ramp so that it gradually gets darker the closer it is to our character. So something like this. Now, if you find yourself tweaking the color ramp and you just see that it's very close together and it's just hard to manipulate, one thing you can do is between the shader to RGB and color ramp, you can use a math node, simply change it to multiply and just increase it to like 2, which is gonna simply allow you to have a better control over the color ramp. You don't have to keep them so tight together anymore. You can increase it to like 6 in order to emphasize this point even more. So we have something like this. It's just much easier to operate on this than it is when it's clustered together. And now as we click play, you can see that everything is moving really nicely. We have really like dynamic dust cloud being kicked out. Maybe there's a little bit too much of this super bright dust. So let's just switch it to something like this. And then again, we can just select the displacement controller and scale it down or up in order to like easily and really fast change the look of our dust cloud. And now with all this done, the last thing is the background. For that, we can simply add a mesh plane, just rotate it by 90 degrees, make sure that it's behind everything and that is huge so that it covers everything in our frame. So we can go into the viewport and rotate it a little bit on the z-axis, just so that we want to make sure it covers all the areas that we're gonna be rendering so that there will be no issue later on. And when it covers everything, we can go back into the shader editor, click new, and this is our background. And here we don't need principled BSDF at all. All we need is a noise texture and an emission shader. And then in between those, we need a color ramp in order to have some colors connected like so. Let's pause the animation and again, click on the noise texture, Ctrl T to get mapping and texture coordinates, change it again to object, and you can either use the simple 3-node technique to stretch the noise, or you can manipulate the scale Y value directly. Change the color ramp again to constant, maybe increase the scale so we have a little bit more to work with, and we can already lay in some colors. So because it's a sky, we can make it blue, and you don't have to worry about proper colors as much right now. Because we will anyway use the compositing and we can adjust a lot of things in there. So don't worry if something doesn't look picture perfect in here, because compositing can fix a lot of issue. But of course, the closer you go to your desired result in here, the less work you'll have in the compositor. So we'll go for a simple 3-color setup, something like this. Maybe it's a bit too stretched. And let's also increase the detail a little bit and the roughness, so it's a little bit jagged. And then same as before, we put a driver into location Z. So hashtag frame and divided by, let's say 20. See how it looks. It's way too fast, so maybe 50, still too fast, so 80 sounds fine. And then depending on your preference, you can either leave it as it is, or you can take the plane and just, while looking at your render preview, you can just scale it up a little bit and then maybe rotate it so that it moves at some sort of angle. Something like this. And one thing you can actually do to sort of separate your final render from everything else that's going on in the background is go to your camera and under the viewport display, drag the passepartout all the way up so that we have the black background and can clearly see what's going to be our final render. So you can see when the sky is on some sort of angle, I think it just looks a little bit better. So I will leave it at that. And that is actually all there is to get a decent render, and the rest of the work is done in the compositing. So we can simply hit F12 to get some render, close it, and go into the compositing tab. And first thing we want is check use nodes, and you should have this visible. If you don't have this backdrop in the background, make sure that it is enabled in here. And if you still don't see anything, then Ctrl Shift and click on render layers, which is gonna give you this viewer, and that should make this background appear for you as well. So here we will do just a little bit, not too much, because the compositing is actually a really powerful tool that I think is being underestimated most of the time. Maybe I will make some more tutorials about it in the future, but for now we will use a hue correct. We're gonna plug right in between, and what this does, it takes your image and it corrects the hue, saturation or value of different colors of your image as it goes. So for example, I have the blue sky. I can just, with the saturation in here selected, bring the blue values all the way down. And now if I preview this, again, Control Shift left mouse button, you can see that the background is completely black and white because I just dropped the saturation of those colors, while the green and the browns and the red is unaffected. So I will probably leave it at this, a little bit less saturated, but still we want to see a little bit of that blue. Then the greens, like make it pop a little bit more, and we can also switch to value and do the same. So the greens are also a little bit brighter, and just, you know, go crazy, do whatever you want with this. The last thing I will do is increase the saturation of the reds, so our character just pops a little bit more. Now the next thing I'm gonna use is the lens distortion, which I'm gonna connect right after the rendered image. And here just be careful because those values are very sensitive, you know. Increasing it just a little bit makes the render much different, but I'm gonna just play with the dispersion a little bit, which is gonna, as you can see, give the chromatic aberration look only on the edges of our picture. And let's also click fit in order for our render to just fit within the whole frame. Well, nothing too crazy, maybe something like this. You can also always just click F12 and see the preview of your final image if this viewport is just, you know, not clear enough for you. So there's that. And the last two things I'm gonna do is add a exposure. Just gonna just brighten the image a little bit across the whole render. And then the last one is posterize. I think that's how you read it. I'm not sure entirely. And so what this does is this sort of, it's hard for me to describe it. So you just, you know, play around with the steps in here and you can see like what the result does. And also if you want to see with or without this node, you simply select the node and click M in order to mute it. And it's just gonna, you know, toggle between this node being active and inactive. So I will just keep it at maybe something like 35. Again, it may not be for everyone. I like this result a little bit, so I'm gonna leave it at this. And that's basically it. That's the whole tutorial. Now when you click F12, you can see the final render. And if you want to render the animation, just render the animation. The compositing is gonna be applied to every single frame, so you should have no problem getting something useful out of it. And you can see the result right here without the compositing. I know that there is a compositing in real time for Blender in the experimental build, so I'm really waiting for it to be released in a stable build. But until then, I guess I'll have to live with this. Hope you learned something, hope you found it useful or at least interesting. And yeah, I know it was a little bit lengthy. If any of you stayed until this moment, then I really thank you, because there is probably like 5 people staying. Would be great if you let me know in the comments so I know who you are and I can, you know, thank you personally, I guess. And I guess I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.